Our story begins with a simple question. What is the origin of plagues? You know, those unpleasant occurrences that have wiped out millions, sometimes billions of people throughout human history. We all kind of assume that they started somewhere else, somewhere very far away and undesirable, somewhere like China or India, maybe Egypt. But rarely do we ever hear about the most important plague of them all, bubonic plague, also known as the Black Death, which supposedly started here in Central Asia. Well, today we're going to talk about exactly that and see what the stories have to say about how this deadly disease started and made its way across the world. I am your host, and today we'll be looking at the 2021 book, The Origin of Pandemics, A History of Epidemics Before 1800 by Timothy R. Weingard. We'll also be looking at various other resources as well, so sit back, relax, and let's find out where did the fever begin and how did it awaken. A storm was coming, and no one saw it. The year was 1346 AD. And sweeping across Europe, Asia, and Africa was a terrible pestilence, one that would change the world forever, causing massive societal upheaval, leading to a decline in population of up to half and transforming economies and cultures. It is said that this illness killed more people than all the wars, famines, and natural disasters that had occurred throughout all of recorded human history. The plague doctors called it pestilence and attributed it to evil-smelling miasma emanating from rotting corpses and filth. Priests blamed divine wrath for the mysterious sickness, while intellectuals like John of Burgundy believed that the air itself had become corrupted. However, what if I were to tell you that the cause of this pandemic wasn't any of these things but something much smaller, something we can't even see with the naked eye? Today, thanks to modern science, we know that this devastating pestilence was caused by a microorganism, Yersinia pestis, or the plague bacillus. This microscopic bacterium, first discovered by Alexandre Yersin in 1894, is transmitted by fleas and primarily affects rodents. Its arrival into the human population was likely an accident, a spillover event where the microbe jumped species and took humanity by storm. The symptoms were horrific, including painful swellings in the groin, armpits and neck, fever, chills, weakness, black spots on the skin, and internal bleeding. Death often occurring within a week after the first signs appeared. But how did this microbe get so far? That's a great question. In fact, that's the whole point of today's episode. Well, you might be surprised to learn that the journey actually started here in Central Asia. There is evidence that the plague bacillus may have resided in this region since as early as the 5th century BC. And although historians are unsure of the exact origin, the general consensus is that somewhere around here, the bacterium mutated from its rodent reservoir to infect humans. This mutation is thought to have occurred due to climatic changes and ecological disruptions caused by the Huns, an aggressive nomadic tribe that migrated into the area in the late 4th century. These events combined to create the perfect conditions for the emergence of pandemics. But how did this ancient disease manage to survive for so long without killing everyone? Well, the answer lies in another characteristic of the plague bacillus, its ability to adapt and persist in different environments. For example, when it encountered new populations, the bacterium mutated into forms that could be passed along by human lice or fleas, allowing it to spread rapidly through large groups of people. Furthermore, the plague bacillus survived in remote areas where humans were less densely populated. Here it would lay dormant until environmental conditions changed, such as during times of ecological disruption or climate change. This allowed the bacteria to persist over long periods of time without being detected. As we mentioned, the most popular theory for the origin of the Black Death is that it started in Central Asia in the mid-14th century. According to this theory, the bacterium arrived in Europe via two main routes. The first route followed the southern route of the Silk Road. Trade along this route was extensive and facilitated the exchange of ideas, goods, and, unfortunately, pathogens. The second route followed the Northern Sea route, which connected the Black Sea with the North Sea. This route became increasingly popular after the Black Sea port of Tana, now the Crimean city of Kerch, was sacked by the Mongols in 1298. The Northern Sea route thus offered a safer alternative for merchants traveling between Asia and Europe. By the mid-14th century, when the plague finally reached Europe, it was too late to stop its advance. The Black Death swept across the continent with terrifying speed, killing millions and leaving entire communities devastated. There are many theories about the origins of the Black Death, but most historians agree that somewhere in Central Asia, this deadly disease started spreading its wings. As we mentioned earlier, there is evidence of the plague bacillus in Central Asia as early as the 5th century BC. Some historians believe that the Black Death may have originated from this ancient strain. Others believe that the plague bacillus may have been brought to Central Asia from other parts of the world, such as India or China. But ultimately, the exact origin of the Black Death remains unknown. So how did it actually spread? Once the plague arrived in Europe, it spread rapidly through the major trading cities. These cities were hubs of trade and commerce, which meant that people from all over the world came together there. Unfortunately, this also meant that diseases from around the world also came together in these cities. The close proximity of people in these cities facilitated the spread of the plague. This was made worse by the poor sanitation and living conditions in many of these cities. As the plague spread through Europe, it continued to evolve and mutate, becoming more deadly and contagious. This made it even more difficult to stop the spread of the disease. Another factor that contributed to the spread of the Black Death was the lack of knowledge about the disease. At the time, people did not understand the true nature of the plague, nor did they know how to prevent or treat it. This led to the spread of misinformation and the adoption of ineffective or even harmful treatments. Additionally, the lack of understanding of basic hygiene and sanitation practices contributed to the rapid spread of the disease. People did not understand the importance of washing their hands or keeping their environment clean. Instead, they relied on methods such as bloodletting and the use of herbal remedies, which were often ineffective or dangerous. One of the most significant effects of the Black Death on society was the massive loss of life. It is estimated that the plague killed around 30 to 50% of the population in some areas of Europe. This had a profound impact on European society, leading to labor shortages, economic instability, and widespread fear. Moreover, the plague had a profound impact on religion and culture. Before the Black Death, the Catholic Church had been the dominant religion in Europe, but the devastation caused by the plague led many to question the Church's teachings. Some people began to turn away from organized religion altogether, while others sought solace in new religious movements such as Protestantism. The Black Death also had a significant impact on art and literature. Many works of art and literature from the period depict the horrors of the plague, such as the Dance of Death, which shows skeletons dancing with humans from all walks of life. The Black Death was a devastating pandemic that had a profound impact on human history. From its mysterious origins in Central Asia to its devastating effects on European society, this deadly disease has left an indelible mark on our past. As we continue to learn more about the Black Death, we can better understand the challenges and changes it brought to our world. It is a reminder of the importance of public health measures and the need for international cooperation in the face of global challenges. Well, folks, that wraps up today's episode. Let me know what you think in the comments section below. Do you think the Black Death was a punishment from God? Was it just a natural disaster? Or was it the result of human activity? Let me know what you think in the comments section below. If you enjoyed this episode, please hit the like button and subscribe. Doing these things will help us grow and bring more historical tales to more people. Thanks for watching. The Ships That Brought Death. In 1347, 13 ships arrived in Sicily. Only one truth survived. Death was aboard. Those ships would go down in history as the plague ships. They brought with them a cargo of men, women, and children who had boarded them in Asia only to die within weeks of relentless fever, aches, chills, and boils. And those who didn't die wished they had, because they were forced to witness their friends, families, and fellow countrymen bloat, burst, and become one with the filthy sea. For those few who did survive the crossing, when they finally set foot on dry land, they carried with them an even deadlier cargo, a pestilence that would change the course of European history forever. Our story begins in the port city of Messina, Sicily, which in 1347 was very much a bustling medieval port town. Back then, the Mediterranean wasn't patrolled by coast guards or immigration officers, so anyone could show up on any given day, bringing with them anything they wanted to sell, from spices and silks to jewels and gold. Merchants would come from as far away as India and China, making the journey over land and sea for months to get there. It was also a military port, hosting a small garrison of soldiers to defend it from invaders and pirates. Messina was a key part of Sicily's defense system against invading armies from Africa. So some soldiers were stationed there year-round, but life went on as normal in the port city. And all that changed in October of 1347, when 13 ships sailed into view. They were large and ornately decorated, adorned with colorful flags and banners fluttering in the wind. They looked like the ships of kings and queens, not peasants. What business could these ships have in Messina? We'll never know. But what we do know is that many of the people on board had been afflicted by something terrible. 13 ships full of people who didn't realize just how terrible. There was no way of knowing at the time, but the men, women, and children aboard those ships weren't carrying suitcases or strollers. They were instead carrying a tiny stowaway that would prove deadly: rats. Rats that carried with them a bacterium called Yersinia pestis, the bubonic plague. From the moment those ships docked in the Sicilian port, death began its grim work. People started getting sick, dying within weeks. By November, things were so bad in Sicily that the monks in charge of recording births and deaths couldn't keep up with the sheer number of people dying each day. As winter set in and Christmas approached, fear swept through the streets of Messina. Was this God's punishment? Had the Christian God abandoned them? To find out, they turned to the church for answers. Their friars told them this must be God's punishment for the sins of man. People had to atone for their sins. Sickness and death were God's way of testing their faith. So they continued going to church every day, praying and confessing their sins until their voices became hoarse, and the plague took more and more lives. But while the friars saw a divine hand at work, others knew something else was happening. When the plague hit, many people thought back to the ships that had arrived from the east. Could this be punishment from God for trading with infidels? Docks were deserted. No one wanted to go near the ships. Soon, everyone in Messina believed the ships were cursed. Fearful whispers spread through the city. The ships brought death. Anyone who came in contact with the ships would die. Even the rats seemed to be cursed. And it didn't stop there. People were terrified that anyone who survived the plague could spread the sickness just by looking at you. With the entire city terrified, people demanded action. On New Year's Day of 1348, the Bishop of Messina ordered all 13 ships burned. But the burning ships weren't enough. The plague continued to kill people throughout Sicily. By mid-January, the city of Palermo was under siege. Entire families were being wiped out by the plague. The smell of death permeated the streets. The bodies were piling up. The church was overwhelmed, and now terrified townspeople were taking matters into their own hands. When the plague first hit, people tried to escape it by fleeing to the countryside. But as the plague spread across Sicily, there was nowhere to hide. Towns were overrun, villages decimated. Many fled to the sea, boats were commandeered. People fled to offshore islands, believing they'd be safe there. But the plague followed them. Soon, these islands were suffering the same fate as Sicily. Eventually, people realized there was no escaping the plague. You either died, or you fled to places like the island of Malta. But there were already so many people there, the island couldn't support them. Supplies ran low, and the people of Malta suffered greatly, and as people fled to Malta, they spread the plague to other parts of the Mediterranean. By 1348, the plague had made its way to the Italian mainland, spreading across northern Italy to France and England. It had gone global. Everywhere it touched, it killed indiscriminately, leaving entire communities decimated. The victims had no idea what was happening to them. At first they felt fine, but soon after, their health rapidly declined. They experienced horrific boils, black spots covering their skin. Then the fever set in, along with weakness, chills, and aches. Victims would soon die, joining the millions who had perished from the plague. It's impossible to say exactly how the plague arrived in Messina, but we do know it likely traveled on the merchant ships. These ships brought goods from Asia, specifically from where the plague originated. From there, it likely found its way onto the docks, infecting rats who lived there. And from there, it jumped species. In particular, it affected the black rat, which was common in Europe during the Middle Ages. But once it infected the rats, it didn't take long for the plague to infect people. The rats transmitted the disease through flea bites. And before anyone knew what was happening, they were infected. As the plague spread across Sicily and the rest of Europe, people reacted in different ways. Some prayed, others fled. Some blamed God, others blamed the Jews. With the plague killing so many people, finding someone to blame was important. If you believed the plague was God's punishment for your sins, then you'd repent, pray, and hope for forgiveness. But if you blamed the Jews, well, you might begin a pogrom, blaming them for the plague and killing many Jews. The Black Death, as it was known, would continue to kill people for years, weakening the economy and changing Europe forever. But back in Messina, the plague ships had docked, and death had begun its grim work. Historians tell the tale of what happened next in vivid detail. Imagine the scene. A small fishing boat approaches the dock. On board are 4 men who've rowed out to retrieve bodies that washed ashore overnight. As they approach the dock, the men see a horrifying sight. The bodies are piled up and oozing pus. Suddenly, one of the sailors sees movement among the bloated corpses. To his horror, the bodies begin to rise. Fleeing in terror, he runs to alert the others. Together, they row as fast as they can away from the cursed ships. But as they pull away, they hear the stench of death carried on the wind behind them. They're never able to escape it. While historians debate whether this tale is true, what's not debated is the devastation caused by the plague ships. What's also undeniable is the lasting impact the plague ships had on history. They marked the beginning of the end for the Middle Ages. This pandemic wiped out almost half of Europe's population, causing havoc across the continent and beyond. This was a pandemic like no other, killing millions. And though the ships that brought the plague eventually disappeared, their legacy would live on for centuries. You can watch our full series on the Black Death here on this channel. We explore how it started, how it evolved, and how it ended, as well as what it means for humanity today. I'm here with a look at what's ahead in history. And as we continue our series looking at the Black Death, the plague that would change the world, next up we have the silence over Europe. Now, when most people think about the Black Death, they tend to focus on how it devastated Asian and European populations. And while the devastation of the disease across the continent is undeniable, for many who experienced it firsthand, their experience of the pandemic was far more than a health crisis. The plague had an impact on every aspect of their lives. In fact, it became a spiritual and emotional crisis for many. So today, let's look at how the Black Death affected people back home. Now, if you're new here and you haven't seen the first episode yet, be sure to check out Journey to Asia before you dive into this one. Now, despite the rapid spread of the illness through the countryside, much of Europe actually remained blissfully unaware of the disaster unfolding nearby for quite some time. But eventually, the news reached them, and when it did, an entire continent began to hold its breath. As the illness moved inland, entire regions felt its weight. Some places were hit harder than others, but nowhere was untouched. In many ways, the pandemic became hyperlocal. That is, the experience of the plague varied from town to town, village to village, even home to home. Churches, markets, homes, they all stood still. All across the continent, people began to feel a sense of dread mixed with curiosity over this mysterious illness. They saw neighbors and friends fall victim to the plague and succumb to death. The daily rhythm of life was disrupted. Shops closed, bells tolled, mass graves were dug. Many turned to faith, others turned to fear. For those who saw the plague coming, there was little they could do to stop it. Those who were spared often wondered why they had been chosen and how they might protect themselves from infection. For many, the answer came in the form of relics or rituals. Throughout Europe, people took pilgrimages to sites of religious significance in hopes of finding protection from the disease. One such site was the Sanctuary of Our Lady of Consolation in the northern Italian city of Bergamo, where the plague first made landfall. Thousands headed there, hoping that the Virgin Mary would spare them from the deadly disease. While the pilgrimage to Consolation drew thousands, another drawing tens of thousands of desperate believers was the dance of the Macarena. Originating in southern Spain, this ritual involved dancing around a statue of the Virgin Mary for 9 hours straight in an attempt to rid oneself of the plague. This frenzied activity required 2 teams of dancers who took turns dancing and resting, moving clockwise and then counterclockwise around the statue. These dances continued in some towns until every participant fell ill, and yet, even after the plague passed, the tradition endured, surviving into the 20th century. As the sick piled up, villages turned to priests for comfort. They provided the sick with last rites and consoled the dying. With the surge of illness, however, came a shortage of clergy. Parish priests fell victim to the plague, and there weren't enough replacements to go around. When a priest did visit the sick, he would only do so under protest, insisting that he was doing it against his own will. Across the continent, the Church tried to find a way to respond to the outbreak. Some, like the flagellant movement, took a harsh stance. Flagellants were members of a Catholic lay movement who believed that God was punishing Europe for its sins, and the only way to appease him was for them to inflict pain upon themselves. They traveled from town to town, whipping themselves as crowds watched and prayed that God would spare them from the plague. They believed that the more they suffered, the greater the chance that God would forgive the people and end the outbreak. Others, like the English Bishop Edmund Custis, focused on prevention. He urged people to avoid contact with the sick, keep their distance, and practice good hygiene. These public health measures were relatively easy to follow, and many European cities adopted them, instituting quarantine measures that helped prevent the disease from spreading. Religious leaders weren't the only ones trying to help. Local officials also took steps to try and contain the spread of the disease. The Italian commune of Florence, for example, established one of the earliest systems of surveillance to track the progress of the disease within the city limits. Officials divided the city into 9 sections and assigned a guard to each section. Every day, the guards visited houses where the plague had been reported and checked on the residents. If anyone showed symptoms of the disease, the guards brought them to a hospital. Unfortunately, the measures taken by religious leaders and local officials were often overshadowed by rumors and misinformation. With no clear understanding of what caused the plague, people were quick to blame others, whether a particular ethnic group, a political rival, or even God himself. Many saw the suffering they endured as evidence of divine punishment, and so they looked for someone or something to blame. In England, people blamed the Jews. Anti-Jewish riots broke out across the country, resulting in the deaths of many innocent Jews. This wasn't the only instance of misplaced blame. Across Europe, people accused various groups of poisoning wells and spreading the disease deliberately. Often these accusations were used as a way to settle scores or target a particular group. In some cases, whole communities were wiped out because of the accusations alone. For some, the cause of the plague was clear: God. However, rather than seeing the outbreak as a punishment from God, some, including the English theologian John Wycliffe, believed that the plague was God's way of thinning out the population. He argued that the high death toll would ultimately benefit humanity because fewer people meant fewer sins. For many Europeans, the silence over their homelands was deafening. The absence of birdsong and the ringing of bells left a heavy silence over the countryside. All across the continent, there was a noticeable decrease in wildlife, especially birds. Infected rodents didn't just kill humans, they killed animals too. And with the massive drop in rodent prey, birds of prey, blackbirds, starling, and sparrows disappeared. People began to take notice and see it as yet another sign that the world was ending. Of course, it wasn't just the absence of birds that people noticed, it was also the absence of other sounds. The sounds of daily life seemed to fade away as the plague took hold. Bells that once tolled merrily stopped ringing. They fell silent as the plague took hold and people died. Funerals were held in silence. Church services were canceled. People were afraid to make noise in case they attracted the attention of the illness itself. Those who were lucky enough to survive the plague never forgot the silence. Years later, one pilgrim described the sound of the plague as the silence of all sounds, for it seemed as though the very air had become deafened. There was another sound that cut through the silence, however, the sound of coins. Amid the chaos and confusion, people still needed to make money, and for some, the plague presented an opportunity to do just that. Many Europeans profited from the plague, whether by selling fake cures or renting rooms in their home to those fleeing the illness. There were also, of course, the gravediggers. With thousands upon thousands of dead bodies piling up, there was a sudden increase in demand for burial services, and those who provided them profited handsomely. As the plague spread, governments struggled to address the economic fallout. Trade routes shut down, businesses closed, and taxes went unpaid. In some places, officials took drastic measures. In an effort to keep people working, Venice even passed laws preventing people from leaving their homes unless it was absolutely necessary. But even this failed to prevent the economic breakdown. By the end of the pandemic, it's estimated that around 30 to 60% of Europe's population was dead. Entire villages were wiped out. Families were torn apart. All across the continent, the plague had an impact on every aspect of people's lives. It changed the way they worked, where they lived, even how they worshipped. The silence over Europe was deafening, but it was also unforgettable. Those who survived the plague carried the memory of those lost with them for the rest of their lives. Next time on our series, we'll look at how the plague reshaped Europe. What do you think? What surprised you the most about the plague's impact on Europe? Let me know in the comments below. And be sure to subscribe if you haven't already so you don't miss the next episode in this series. I'll see you there. When I think about the deadliest plagues that have ever struck humanity, I think about bodies piled up in the streets, rampant death and fear. But what I don't often think about are the doctors of the time. They are mostly absent from my mind, despite being essential in trying to stop or even cure the outbreaks. To be fair, this is likely because they didn't have a lot of success. However, it's still fascinating to look at what they did try to do. How did doctors respond to the plague? What were their theories? And how did their attempts to help sometimes make things worse? Let's find out. In modern times, we associate the Black Death with the image of the plague doctor. These men wore long, thick coats with a mask attached. They would walk around cities treating the sick and dying. Well, they weren't called doctors. More on that later. This outfit is one of the most iconic images of the plague. However, while we know the reason behind the mask, the rest of the outfit isn't as obvious. The long coat was likely an attempt to emulate the bird that was thought to be the vector of the disease. This particular bird was known for covering itself in oil and dirt to treat itself. Thus, the healers copied this behavior. These days, we know that the plague was transmitted through fleas on rats and not birds. As for the masks, though, these were much more practical. The most common design was a beak-like shape that was filled with fragrant substances. This would help purify the air that the doctor inhaled, helping them avoid getting sick. While we know this doesn't work, the idea behind it is somewhat sound. The plague was believed to be spread by bad air, or miasma. The fragrant materials would somehow block this miasma from entering the lungs. Some of the more extreme masks had bellows built into them. These were basically a set of lungs that the doctor could breathe through, avoiding the need to breathe through their mouth or nose. The substances used in the masks varied depending on the region. Some common ones included flowers, herbs, vinegar, honey, camphor, dried fruit, pepper, cloves, nutmeg, wine, opium, and burnt animal fat. Obviously, none of these things would have helped the patients, but some of them may have helped the doctors avoid getting infected. The reason why doctors wore these masks was because they believed that bad air was causing the disease. This was a pretty common theory at the time, and they weren't the only ones who believed it. People thought that the disease could be spread through things like clothing or furniture, too. For this reason, many people burned their belongings after someone died of the plague. While this wouldn't kill the bacteria, it might have made them feel better. Since the plague was spread through fleas on rats, this wasn't the worst theory per se, but it definitely wasn't the best. Another popular theory was that the disease was caused by an imbalance of the four humors. This is a bit vague, but essentially everything in your body was made up of four elements: blood, phlegm, black and yellow bile. The balance of these elements determined your health. If you had too much of one or not enough of another, you would become sick. This theory actually stuck around until the mid-17th century. Doctors attempted to fix this imbalance with things like leeching, blistering, and purging. Basically, they wanted to get rid of one of the humors. One method of purging was giving patients large amounts of mercury. Mercury is poisonous, but doctors thought that its side effects were actually the cure for the plague. In reality, they were just making their patients sicker. Doctors weren't the only ones trying to help people. During the plague, communities would often turn to healers and caretakers. These people were usually women, and they often used home remedies to help people. Some of these remedies were surprisingly effective. For example, people drank large amounts of alcohol to disinfect themselves. While rubbing alcohol might be too strong nowadays, back then it was a common disinfectant. Communities also created quarantines. In Italy, during the 1348 outbreak, houses with infected people were sealed off with wax. Red crosses were drawn on the doors. Any violators of quarantine were punished. These punishments varied depending on who you asked, but could include heavy fines, exile, or even death. Venice even created a special police force to enforce quarantine rules. While it might seem easy to judge these people and their methods, it's important to remember that they had no idea what they were dealing with. They couldn't see bacteria or viruses under a microscope. They had no idea that the plague was being spread by rats. They had to make the best of what little they knew. To be fair, some of their ideas were actually quite good. During the 1665 London outbreak, people were ordered to close their doors and windows. This stopped the plague from spreading through the air. Authorities also banned public gatherings and ordered people to wear masks. These measures may have not stopped the plague, but they did slow it down. What about those doctors that wore the masks? To be honest, they weren't really doctors. The title doctor was usually reserved for those who had gone to university. There were many different types of healers. Some of them were barbers, surgeons, or apothecaries. These people had a variety of titles, such as bleeders or bone setters. A few of these men did actually become famous. The most famous of these men was likely Guy de Chauliac. He was a French military surgeon who treated kings and popes. He also treated plague victims. During the 1348 outbreak, he wrote about his experiences treating patients. He described the symptoms and how the disease progressed. He also spoke about the treatments that were used, both helpful and harmful. Despite this, he believed that the disease was caused by an imbalance of the four humors. Another well-known figure was Thomas Sydenham. Unlike de Chauliac, Sydenham was actually a real doctor. He graduated from Oxford University in 1649. During the plague, he published a book detailing how he treated patients. His book was quite successful and went through multiple editions. Unlike many of his contemporaries, he believed that the disease was caused by something outside of the body, not an imbalance of humors. Unfortunately, he died in 1689 before the germ theory was developed. During the outbreaks, many people chose to flee cities. This led to entire towns being abandoned. However, this wasn't the best idea. The plague could easily be transported by animals and people. Entire villages that fled the plague often ended up right back in the middle of it. This led to a lot of mistrust between towns. People began blaming each other for bringing the sickness to their town. Sometimes they would even take drastic measures. In 1348, 3 ships arrived in England carrying the plague. The people on board had fled Florence, thinking that they could avoid the disease by going north. The people of London, however, weren't having it. They blocked the ships from docking and forced the people to stay on board. Many of the passengers ended up dying on board. Those who survived were executed or imprisoned. The plague outbreaks were devastating. No matter what people did, hundreds of thousands of people died. They learned what didn't work and what may have worked. While some things were done in the name of science, others were simply done because they made people feel better. Even though the mortality rate was extremely high, some things learned during these outbreaks helped doctors save lives in the future. The Black Death is over. Rejoice! Let the feasting and the games begin. Wait, what's that? You don't feel so good. Ah, it seems the plague has come back. Oh dear, did we just have a plague du jour? Are you kidding me? It's not even summer yet. You know what? Forget about summer. There will be no more summers for the foreseeable future. Just look at this graph. Does this look like the graph of a recovering population? Looks more like a hockey stick with a bite taken out of it. And why does it matter anyway? Life expectancy was still higher when the Black Death hit than it would ever be again for centuries. The world would never go back to how it was before the plague. So let's take a look at the changed world after the storm. Tagline: after the storm, nothing was the same. The illness left lasting effects on society. With fewer people, systems had to change. Work, land, power, and education all shifted. For those who didn't die from the plague, life went on. Farming, mining, construction, manufacturing, merchants, trading, fishing, hunting, all needed to be done. Someone had to make sure the world kept turning. But there was one big problem. The plague had killed millions of people across Europe, an estimated 30 to 50% of the population. In some places, whole villages were wiped out. In others, half of the people were gone. This meant there were simply fewer people to do all the work that had to be done. This created a labor shortage that lasted for decades. In many places, landlords raised rents on farms because now they could get more money for less product. That's what happens in a free market economy when supply and demand shift. Well, except the workers could just leave and find another farm to work on. But here's the thing. Before the plague, if a worker wanted to switch jobs, he might have been out of luck. Not only were there few jobs available, but he was also tied to the land by a system called manorialism. Workers were legally bound to the land they worked on and couldn't easily move somewhere else unless their lord agreed to it. Now that the lords needed workers more than ever, they were able to enforce this system even more tightly. They built up large workforces that stayed in one place and worked for them for their entire lives. Well, almost their entire lives. Eventually, they would all die and the lords would need to start looking for new workers. Many people thought this labor shortage was temporary and things would eventually return to normal once the surviving family members had more children and brought them into the workforce. But this time was different. People weren't having as many children after the plague. Why? Well, having children meant risking them dying from the plague. Families were also poorer than they used to be, and children were often put to work instead of going to school. Finally, women had more options outside of marriage than ever before. Many of them took advantage of the labor shortage to negotiate better wages or just find a new job. Marriage rates dropped dramatically. All of these factors led to a baby bust in the decades following the plague. Fewer babies meant a smaller workforce in the future, which meant landlords had to make some big changes. While some lords tried to hold on to the old ways of doing things, others began experimenting with new ideas like sharecropping. Instead of paying rent for the use of the land, sharecroppers paid their rent with a portion of what they grew on the land. This encouraged the survivors to work harder since they were taking a greater risk and would see greater rewards if they succeeded. These new ideas did spread to other parts of Europe over time, but they took root first in England. Suddenly, England was seen as a modernizing force in Europe. A new spirit of innovation swept through the country, especially in agriculture, where innovations such as new plows and seed drills improved productivity. Improvements in shipping and trade soon followed. Soon, England became known as the workshop of Europe, as English products were in high demand throughout the continent. Tagline: labor shortages and social mobility, the decline of certain systems and rise of others. The plague also led to the end of serfdom. Remember how we talked about how workers couldn't leave their lord without his permission? Well, with the labor shortage, that changed. Peasants could now bargain for better working conditions and wages. In fact, peasants were in such high demand that some of them ended up owning the land they worked on. Some former nobles who lost their workers moved to cities while others sold their estates and became merchants themselves. One peasant from Essex rose through the ranks thanks to the labor shortage and became Lord Mayor of London. His story was far from unique. Thanks to the plague, there was now more social mobility than ever before. While it would take centuries for these changes to fully take shape, seeds were planted during the 14th century. Tagline: early signs of modernization. Work, land, and power all changed. The next couple of centuries saw significant changes in where people worked, what they did for work, and who had the power. From a young age, boys were put to work in various trades, often learning the skills of a master craftsman. When they were old enough, they would set off to become traveling craftsmen, moving from place to place, selling their wares. Meanwhile, girls were often apprenticed to a woman in a particular craft, working alongside her in whatever business she was in. Most of these apprentices would end up marrying and starting their own business in the same field as their mentor. Guilds thrived across Europe, with each city having its own unique mix of craftspeople. Members of guilds controlled the production of goods within a particular industry, setting standards and protecting their interests. They set rules about the quality of goods and the price they could be sold for. They also set rules about who could join their organization. Often, members of a guild had to be the son or daughter of a person already in the guild. Traveling merchants were usually guild members, but a guild for merchants and traders existed too, with many of the same rules and regulations as other guilds. They also worked hard to protect their economic interests by negotiating with local governments. Meanwhile, life on the farmstead changed drastically after the plague. Farms were getting larger and larger, with some nobles even buying out neighboring farms to expand their land. This required new technology to manage the increased size of the farms. Large farms needed new tools to plant crops more efficiently, meaning those with access to capital could invest in new technologies. Meanwhile, new financial instruments developed to allow wealthy merchants and investors to pool their resources together. Suddenly, double-entry accounting became very important. Without it, tracking all of these transactions would be nearly impossible. This new system revolutionized record-keeping and allowed merchants to engage in long-distance trade with much greater ease. But the biggest impact was felt in the countryside. Landowners were beginning to realize they could get more productivity from their fields if they divided the land and rented it out to tenant farmers. The nobility also realized they could make more money from their land if they diversified the crops grown there. By diversifying, landowners could grow crops like wheat and barley. then sell the food they grew to the rising population centers. The growth of towns and cities continued in the decades after the plague, though most Europeans still lived in the countryside. Still, urban centers were growing quickly. In England, the King's Council took on a new look after the plague, with new faces becoming prominent in government. Because so many of the old nobility died from the plague, new families were able to rise through the ranks and gain favor with the monarch. While the old families might have been wiped out, their lands were still there to be managed. So new offices developed to oversee these estates. New taxes were also created to support the growing administrative state, which further increased the power of the king. Monarchies across Europe had to adapt. Those that survived the plague emerged with more power than ever before. This isn't to say everyone abandoned the countryside. In fact, some innovative farming techniques developed in France in the decades after the plague. Known as the French Innovation, it combined crops in new ways to improve soil quality. The three-field system rotated crops to ensure part of the land was always being restored to peak fertility. Meanwhile, a new style of windmill was introduced to France from England. This style was more efficient at grinding grain. This allowed farmers to process their grain much faster, freeing up their time to pursue other opportunities. Tagline: Education and Culture, the Birth of Humanism and the Renaissance. Finally, the plague had an impact on education. With so many people dead, there were fewer students to teach and fewer teachers to teach them. Church attendance fell off dramatically, as did funding for monasteries, which resulted in the decline of monastic schools. On top of this, the printing press had just been invented and books were suddenly cheaper and more widespread than ever before. Wealthy merchants began commissioning private tutors for their children, leading to an increase in secular education. To make matters worse, universities across Europe suffered from low enrollment and a lack of funding, which caused professors to travel around giving lectures wherever they could get an audience. Out of this cultural shift came humanism, a new way of thinking that emphasized the importance of the individual. Humanist scholars studied classical texts from Greece and Rome, rediscovering works of philosophy and literature that had been lost for centuries. This intellectual movement paved the way for the Renaissance, a rebirth of classical learning, which took place across Europe in the decades that followed. Click here to learn more about humanism and the Renaissance, or click here to watch this video instead. We've heard this story before. A new disease emerges, spreads quickly across the world, and kills millions of people. It seemed like nothing could stop it. No amount of money or power could keep you safe. Eventually, though, humanity turned the tide and now we have a shot at stopping it. But that's not the end. Even after the immediate threat passes, there are still challenges to overcome. You might think this story is over, but its echoes still ring true today. What if I told you this story happened twice? Once 700 years ago and again just over a century ago? It's not a coincidence. There's something about the way this story goes that we haven't quite learned yet. The story is old, but the lessons feel new. In 1346, a Genoese trading ship docked in Sicily. It had traveled from the east, bringing with it exotic goods and, perhaps more importantly, exotic diseases. At least one of those diseases was bubonic plague. It's usually spread by fleas living on rats and would go on to kill an estimated 25 million Europeans over the next few years, killing nearly half of the people in some places. That wasn't the first time plague hit Europe, but this time things were different. Old habits no longer helped, and new treatments weren't available. As the Black Death swept across the continent, killing lots of people very quickly, people looked for answers. There was no shortage of ideas, but they tended to fall into two categories: the scientific and the divine. Some blamed the air, others blamed God. But in both cases, people felt powerless against whatever was causing the plague. This isn't too surprising. For most of human history, we didn't know what caused diseases, how to treat them, or even how to prevent their spread. That didn't mean people didn't try. There were doctors and healers, but their treatment sometimes made things worse. For example, bloodletting, which involved draining out some of your blood, was common. Doctors thought that balancing the body's humors would help against the plague, but they usually ended up making things worse. Today we know that what caused the plague was a bacterium called Yersinia pestis. This bacterium started in rodents and then spread to humans through fleas. Infected fleas would latch onto people and then pass on the bacteria through their bites. This isn't exactly easy to avoid, especially when you're in a big city. That's part of why so many people got sick. But even once people knew what was causing the plague, it wasn't clear what to do about it. Back then, the best idea was a combination of quarantine and mass killing. As soon as a ship carrying infected people arrived in a port city, authorities should have quarantined everyone on board. And once the disease started spreading, they should have quarantined anyone who came into contact with an infected person. If that sounds familiar, it's because these are the same strategies we use to fight diseases today. But back then, there was also another option, mass killing. Authorities would round up cats and dogs, especially black ones, and kill them. They also killed rats and burned their bodies. These measures didn't really work, but people kept trying different ideas until they found something that did work. Eventually, people realized that avoiding contact with infected people and animals was the best strategy. That meant staying away from cities, avoiding contact with traders coming from elsewhere, and maybe, just maybe, keeping your distance from rats. These ideas are also used today, but they weren't enough back then. People still needed ways to treat those who were already sick. Most of the proposed treatments were ineffective, but one was extremely effective. And ironically, it wasn't even intended to treat the plague. At the time, the most popular treatment was drinking large amounts of wine and using leeches. But one doctor named Guy de Chauliac recommended something different: blood transfusions. He believed that since the plague caused blood to turn black, you should replace that bad blood with good blood from someone else. In 1364, he wrote, "Take a healthy and well-conditioned animal, such as a sheep or goat, having carefully opened the veins of both the animal and the ill person. Let the blood be transfused from the one to the other." Today, we know blood transfusions can save lives, but at the time, they often did more harm than good. Most of the time, the blood transfusions simply gave patients other diseases, and that's probably what happened to one of de Chauliac's patients, King Edward, the Black Prince of England. After receiving several transfusions, he developed a fever and died a few weeks later. These days, blood transfusions are incredibly common and can save lives. Hospitals have systems to test blood and make sure it's compatible, and they screen donors to make sure they don't have diseases. None of that was around in the Middle Ages. So, although the idea of blood transfusions was right, the practice wasn't ready for prime time. The good news is that people were thinking creatively and trying new things. The bad news is that most of those new things didn't work. This isn't that different from today. When COVID-19 hit, scientists around the world raced to find new treatments. They tried everything, including plasma transfusions from people who recovered from COVID-19. These days, there are a couple of drugs that we know work against COVID-19. Monoclonal antibodies can reduce the risk of hospitalization. But these are hardly a cure-all. And unfortunately, we're dealing with a virus, not a bacterium. That means it's possible that today's miracle drug will be tomorrow's useless pill as the virus mutates. The reason that we haven't found a lasting solution to pandemics is that they're actually pretty complicated. Disease doesn't care about borders or politics. It doesn't care how much money you have or what religion you follow. It just cares about one thing: survival. That means it forces us all to deal with it together. And it turns out that humans aren't always great at working together. After the Black Death finally ran its course in Europe, people felt like they had learned a lot. They had watched their population plummet, and they had tried just about everything imaginable to stop it. It seemed logical that that would lead to change, and at first it seemed like it would. Many people abandoned cities for the countryside. Others took up arms against nobles and kings who they felt exploited them. Some argued that since life was so fragile, they might as well live it to the fullest. One Italian author wrote, "Since all human life is so uncertain, it follows that he who has been granted a remission of his mortality should live in such a way that whilst he has life, he shall not fear death." But overall, life didn't really change. People eventually moved back to cities. Kings stayed kings, and the general public stayed poor. A few hundred years later, Europe would erupt in a different pandemic. The bubonic plague returned. This time it hit England hard, killing an estimated 25% of the population. By the time the disease was finally brought under control, it was the 17th century, and the world was totally different. There were new technologies, new economies, and new ways of thinking. The plague may have been brought under control, but that didn't mean it was over. It would continue to pop up over the centuries until finally, in the 1800s, it was brought under control for good. Today, we know that the plague happens naturally. Wild rats can carry the disease and pass it along to prairie dogs. Sometimes those cases spill over into humans, but thankfully it's pretty rare. There are other diseases that seem to come out of nowhere, but they're actually old friends. Smallpox, yellow fever, polio, SARS and MERS, H1N1 and COVID-19, none of these diseases were caused by completely new viruses. They were all caused by viruses that evolved and jumped species. And that's likely to happen again in the future. So what should we do? Well, let's look to the past for some answers. First, we should listen to science. During the Black Death, scientists were able to figure out what caused the plague and how it spread. And these days, we have amazing technology to understand how viruses work and track how they spread. But listening to science is only half the battle. We also have to communicate science effectively. When the disease hit, people didn't immediately know what was causing it. And when they did, they didn't know how to stop it. That led to panic, scapegoating, and mass killing. That isn't productive. So we need to make sure that everyone has access to accurate information, and we shouldn't stop there. We also need to be compassionate. During the Black Death, people were afraid and desperate. They didn't know what was causing the disease, how to stop it, or how to treat it. Those are tough circumstances, but if we want to get through future outbreaks, we need to make sure that everyone feels supported. There are other things that we can do. Quarantining infected individuals and disinfecting areas where people gather are good ideas. Mass killing animals isn't, but we can always improve. Today we have better tools and a better understanding of diseases. We can use those tools to stay ahead of future outbreaks, but that's only if we learn from the past. A few hundred years ago, we were able to stop deadly diseases, but we didn't put them behind us. And as a result, we're still dealing with the consequences today. Hopefully, we can do better next time. What's one thing you think we can do better next time? Let me know down in the comments below. And while you're down there, you might as well subscribe. I know you want to. And thanks to my patrons for supporting this channel. Yersinia pestis is scary, but it's not the scariest thing out there.